Okay, so here we are in part 3 of this lecture in chapter 2, and go ahead and take a look at your Native American, this map right here in your textbook about indigenous Native Americans. And I wanted you to see at least this thing called the Trail of Tears and the 5 great tribes of the South for the Cherokee, Chickasaw, I can't name them all, but anyway, they all end up basically out in Oklahoma, 4,000 or more of them dying, but being pushed out. This was Andrew Jackson wanted this to happen, and subsequent presidents made sure it became a reality. So when you start to look at a map of the United States, the green stuff is where, well, the whole thing is where the Indian tribes, the native indigenous peoples lived before they were felled by disease, killed by settlers, and eventually an American government, and pushed into the far fringes of the areas, these areas like Cherokee, North Carolina might stand out, but the Osage were the dominant group of Native Americans in Oklahoma before 5 tribes were pushed out there. You see this area here in South Dakota. This is the Lakota Sioux, and we'll talk later about their most sacred site and why it was important for President Trump to go out there and speak. I think it was on 4th of July in 2020 when he spoke out in front of Mount Rushmore in front of 4 presidents. But understanding that 4 presidents are on the most holy and sacred sites of the Lakota Sioux, that's pretty important to think about. We're going to look, though, at the Navajo down in this area. They are dominant, but they weren't here all the time. In fact, we're going to look at the language itself. So who was here first were the ancestral Puebloans. They had fallen, their society had broken down after a drought. Maybe, what was it, about 800 or so years ago. There was a prolonged drought here, and many of those Puebloans died off in the same way that if you look at the Mayan city-states, they overextended themselves, wasted the environment, and fell as a dominant culture group. This group did too. The Navajo came in later. Navajo dominate, but they're the ones, the Navajo, who named the ancestral Puebloans the Anasazi, or the ancient ones. So the Anasazi is what they called them. But look, this is a dominant Indian group coming in and lording over smaller decentralized groups now, that the Anasazi who built, Cliff Palace. This is Canyon de Chelly. I'll come back to my point. Canyon de Chelly, this is, wonderful place I had visited with my students, bought a piece of art from a woman who was there on one of the walks and lookovers of that national park. And this is, Cliff Palace. You can go and see these ruins. They farmed the top of the mesa, but they built these structures in those overhanging walls, and they made a great culture. So that was the Navajo that named them. Well, what does the common dominant culture often do? They force a name on a group. So when we look at the dominant Navajo, guess what? Navajo is not their name. They are called the Dene. D-I-N-E with the accent mark over the E. And they speak of the Na-Dene language. But why are they called Navajos? Well, that's because what the white people wanted to call them. So you see this in a couple of different generational culture groups, but it shouldn't be a surprise to you that white culture comes after that and dominates. The Spanish culture was out here before, still pretty strong, don't get me wrong, but know about the culture groups as they move through. We are focusing on the indigenous groups, though, here, and so lots of nice lore out here. This is Spider Rock. Why I included it is because the cap rocks on top of this pinnacle out here in the southwest, there's actually a little ruin that's right down here, I think is where it is. I can't see it in this picture, but the people, the Navajo, and the Puebloans before, I believe, that story carried through, that to get the children to mind their parents, they told that the white rocks that were up here were actually bones of children who didn't obey their parents. That was told to us by the park ranger. So that was kind of funny, but still very thriving culture out here, but certainly isolated into an area and very mixed up. Don't think, too, that the ancestral Puebloans get along with the Navajo any better than all the other groups did before. They don't like each other that much, to be honest. Moving forward in your textbook, you'll look at a new kind of literature is coming out in cultural geography, and that is queer geography or gay geography. And this has been a long time coming. If you lived in some of the bigger cities, first time I actually saw out gay people was when I visited San Francisco, and I was in my 20s by the time I did that. So it was probably in 1993 when I saw that. And, two guys walking in downtown San Francisco with their hands arm in arm and hands in the back of each other's pockets. It's like, oh, okay, well, there that is. And it didn't matter to me. I've never really cared. But some people certainly do. And they say things like, we don't want it in our face. The LGBT community were always here because the dominant culture didn't want to look at them. They could force them into the places they wanted to. In the bigger cities, that at least have districts. And so your textbook covers this, but look at the norming of LGBT. And it goes further now. We know about trans communities, and we know about cis-identification, and I'm not going to get into all of it because while I know it, I don't know it by heart, and I would probably muddle it somewhat. But we see a guy who, was Terry Sweeney, as you see on the screen here. He was the first outwardly gay man in a television show, and he worked for a time on Saturday Night Live. Ellen DeGeneres is well known, but she had a TV show long before she came out, and now, of course, she lives a totally out lifestyle. And the norming of this, that a sitcom like Modern Family could come along and all of us watch it and laugh like crazy. It's generational, old, May December relationships, interracial relationships, gay relationships. It hit it all, and it was a funny show. But that said, you have to be kind of exposed to these things. At first, it's glaring and shocking to you, and you don't know what to think. And I've been taught that's a sin, and all those kinds of things. You still may think it's a sin, having gay love. I think this is too tough of a world, and that the more love we have, the better. But you don't have to agree with me, and I'm not trying to make you believe in my gay agenda. I don't have a gay agenda. I have a people agenda and a culture agenda, and that's what I'm teaching you here, that gay culture does exist, and has always, been there, but now it's kind of thriving. And I appreciate, the diversity that they bring to the table because it makes the world, in my point of view, a more interesting place. So looking at that a little bit further here, this is subcultures that was, in your textbook, looking at groups that they stand out because they don't want to be part of the norm. But look how important these groups are at defining what is normal. Very outwardly gay, very outwardly antisocial to counterculture to whatever it is. I, again, find those things as a valuable markers within a society to let you know what is norm and acceptable. And we've been pushing those boundaries in America for a long time. And I'm glad to say that the millennials that have come along have certainly really pushed those boundaries now. They don't really care so much as an entity, as a group, not as individuals. But that said, subcultures are still there. Previously talking about Metallica and Megadeth and Slayer, I got made fun of for liking those bands. But I didn't care because I like the bands. So now they're mainstream, playing on shows, and they're at every arena that you go to because of the music. So when we talk about these things, just I'm putting in perspective for you. Your textbook covers vampire tourism, and so you can read about that. But selling of Vlad Dracul, Vlad the Impaler, heck, the glittery vampires that are out in whatever it was in the book series that were made into books or into movies with William Pattinson and whatever. Pattison. I don't even know his name. I'm sorry. I didn't like the stuff, so I didn't watch it. But I do love horror and vampires and stuff. I just didn't like the glittery ones that fell in love. But anyway, that said, think about all the different places that will market themselves for their niche. At Colonial Williamsburg, what makes it colonial? Well, because that's the name they put on it, and they want to market it. And when you look at the landing of the first Negroes, I went and looked this up, and this is how they're trying to, this is their new kind of this year and next tourism thing, so they can change it up, so they can get the people that like this concept of Colonial Williamsburg to come back again and buy more stuff in their gift shop. My mother went there. I haven't been there, but she said, oh, so much of it was made in China. You know, she didn't think it was very colonial at all. Well, no, it's marketing. It's popular culture. And that's what is driving a lot of this. Okay. You also see Sudanese culture mentioned in your textbook. What you might not know is Gallatin has a Sudanese Presbyterian church, and that many of these are from the newer ethnic group. There are dominant two groups in South Sudan, which were the Dinka and the Nuer, and they found a way to work together for 30 years trying to fight off North Sudan, the Arabs, and get independence, and then fought amongst themselves as soon as they got independence. But that said, they have a church here in Gallatin. If you ever want to go to it, Sunday they'll open the doors and welcome you in. But looking at a diaspora, a dispersed culture is what's happened here. A student of mine that I liked a lot, I hope he won't mind that I'm using his name, was Rout Wang. That dude sat in the back of my class years ago, and I talked with him, and I asked him, well, how many languages do you speak? Because I was trying to make a point to my other students. He said, I speak six languages fluently. But he was one of these lost boys that ended up in refugee camps over in Kenya, and he knew languages of trade there and learned English eventually, and so forth. So I look at these individuals as very intelligent people. I don't have the command of languages. That's magic to me. I don't understand it. I don't even speak English very well. So I love a very diverse linguistic society. I wish America were more linguistically diverse, not looking for an official English language, which we'll talk about in our chapter 4. But certainly a common language is what we have. Okay, look at one or two more things before my time runs out. I want to look at distribution of things. And so this is a distribution of blowguns. I just wanted you to kind of see how we look at cultural items. So were blowguns independent inventions in places? And the answer is yes. Did they diffuse to all places, though? And you'd say, well, I'm not sure of that. And we can't know for sure. But we see them all over the New and the Old World. What we'll know that the use of blowguns in this area, though, was diffused as a knowledge by boats, because we know the languages of the archipelago here in Southeast Asia matches up with Madagascar. Madagascar does not match with Africa at all linguistically. Those people came from here. So we know that that was diffusion. But then we would see a wholly different invention over here. And so when you look at, for instance, I'm sorry, I got to go back. I apologize. There we go. When you look at poison dart frogs, for instance, these things are about like the tip of your finger, pinky finger. These things are tiny. And when I was in Costa Rica right here, walking in rainforest, those things were everywhere. I had to look everywhere I stepped so I wouldn't step on those little guys. I think this one is called strawberry. But what were they used for? The arrows in those blowguns. They would rub on the backs of these frogs. It was a neurotoxin. They shoot then the dart with the poison on the tip up into the trees and kill the bird, the monkey, or whatever it is, and they've got their meal. And this makes sense, but I at least wanted to use this as an idea about how mobility is very important within geography too, and as a concept of culture. So I think I've proved that here. Hopefully I have. And I'll stop and move on to the next section of this chapter in part 4 of my lecture. All right. See you in a few. Bye-bye.